Story 1: Whispers in the Dark. A faint breeze swept through the dimly lit apartment as Amir sat in the living room, staring at the flickering light of the television. The soft hum of the news anchor's voice filled the space, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been 3 years since he married Zara, and their life together had been mostly ordinary, quiet, filled with routine. Yet, in the past few months, he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that gnawed at him from within. Something felt wrong. He glanced toward the kitchen where Zara busied herself, her long dark hair flowing down her back as she hummed a soft, unfamiliar tune. Amir had always admired how gracefully she moved, how effortless her presence seemed. But there were moments, fleeting moments, where he felt as though the woman in his home was something else. It wasn't just his imagination. Over the past few months, there had been small, unsettling incidents, shadows that lingered too long, whispers in the middle of the night that seemed to come from nowhere, and the strange way the room would drop several degrees when Zara was angry or upset. He had brushed them off as stress from work, sleepless nights, anything but the unthinkable. Tonight, however, was different. Zara turned off the faucet and began drying her hands, the soft clinking of dishes echoing in the kitchen. Amir's stomach churned with anxiety, his thoughts racing. He tried to convince himself that it was nothing, but a nagging suspicion had begun to claw its way into his consciousness. A suspicion he couldn't ignore any longer. It was nearly midnight when Zara finally joined him on the couch. She sat close, her body warm against his, but Amir felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You look tired, love," Zara said, her voice smooth, almost hypnotic. Amir forced a smile. "Just thinking about work." She smiled, a knowing smile, one that made Amir's skin prickle. "You've been so quiet lately. Is something wrong?" Her question lingered in the air, filled with a weight Amir couldn't quite place. For a moment, he considered telling her everything, the shadows, the voices, the unsettling cold, but he stopped himself. He didn't want to sound paranoid. "No, everything's fine," he lied. Zara reached out and gently stroked his cheek, her touch softer than he remembered. As her fingers brushed his skin, Amir felt an odd sensation, like a static charge or an electric shock. He pulled away reflexively, his heart pounding. Zara's expression flickered for just a second, something dark and cold flashing in her eyes, but it vanished so quickly that Amir wondered if he had imagined it. "I'm going to bed," Zara said softly. "You should get some rest too." Amir nodded and watched as she disappeared into their bedroom, the door clicking shut behind her. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding and slumped back into the couch, the flickering light of the television casting strange, distorted shadows across the room. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong with Zara. Amir waited until he was sure she was asleep before creeping into the bedroom. Zara lay still under the covers, her breathing slow and steady. For a moment, she looked peaceful, just like the woman he had married. But something inside Amir screamed that this wasn't right. The woman he had loved for 3 years wasn't what she seemed. Careful not to wake her, Amir tiptoed over to her side of the bed. His hands trembled as he reached for her phone, hoping to find some answers. Maybe there was an explanation for all the strange things that had been happening, messages, calls, anything. He opened her phone, and immediately, his heart stopped. The wallpaper was a photograph of him, but not just any photograph. It was a picture of him sleeping, taken from an angle that was impossible for Zara to have reached without waking him. The angle was above, almost as if someone, or something, had been hovering over him. Chilled to the core, Amir scrolled through her messages, but they were all mundane conversations with friends and coworkers. Nothing seemed out of place. He was about to put the phone down when an unfamiliar app caught his eye. It had no name, just a strange symbol that looked like an ancient script. He had never seen anything like it before. His hand hesitated above the icon before tapping it. The screen flickered, and then it filled with cryptic symbols, incomprehensible words written in a language he didn't understand. Amir's pulse quickened. The longer he stared at the screen, the more the words seemed to shift and change, as though they were alive. A low hum filled his ears, and his vision began to blur. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him. Amir turned sharply to find Zara standing at the bedroom door, watching him. Her face was expressionless, her eyes unreadable. "What are you doing, Amir?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but the words wouldn't come. The phone slipped from his hand and landed on the floor with a dull thud. Zara stepped closer, and for the first time, Amir noticed something terrifying. Her shadow on the wall, it wasn't hers. It was taller, broader, and its shape was wrong, inhuman. The shadow moved independently, stretching its dark arms as if reaching for him. Amir stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Zara, what's going on? What are you?" Zara tilted her head, her lips curling into a sinister smile. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask." Her voice was no longer soft and gentle. It was deeper, echoing with an unnatural cadence that made Amir's blood run cold. The air in the room grew thick, oppressive, and the temperature dropped sharply, the walls creaking under the sudden chill. Zara, or whatever she was, took another step toward him. "You should have stayed ignorant, Amir. But now that you know, there's no going back." Amir backed away, his mind racing. He had no idea what he was dealing with, but he knew he needed to get out of the house. He turned and bolted for the door, but as his hand grasped the doorknob, a force slammed into him, throwing him across the room. He hit the wall hard, gasping for breath as he tried to stand. Zara was standing over him now, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The shadow behind her writhed and twisted, growing larger, more menacing. 3 years, Amir," she whispered. 3 years I've waited, and now you've ruined everything." Amir's head spun as he tried to understand what she meant. His thoughts were jumbled, his body aching from the impact. He struggled to his feet, his eyes darting around the room for something, anything, that could help him. What are you?" he managed to choke out. Zara's smile widened, her teeth sharp and glistening in the dim light. "Not what you think, Amir. I am far older than you could ever imagine. I've lived in the shadows, unseen, for centuries. You were just a part of the plan." Amir's blood ran cold. "Plan? What plan?" Zara leaned closer, her breath cold against his skin. "To claim you, of course." Before Amir could react, the shadow behind her surged forward, enveloping him in darkness. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void, his voice lost in the oppressive blackness. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him completely was Zara's glowing eyes, watching him with cruel delight. Then everything went silent. Amir awoke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. He was lying on the floor of the living room, the television still flickering with static. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare, a terrible dream. But as he looked around, he saw Zara standing in the doorway, watching him. Her eyes were no longer glowing, her face calm and serene. But the shadow behind her, it was still wrong. "Time for bed, love," she said sweetly, as if nothing had happened. Amir's heart raced as he stared at her, unsure of what was real and what was not. But one thing was certain, the woman he had married was no ordinary person. And whatever she was, It was far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 2. Amir barely slept that night. His mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Zara's face, her eyes glowing with that unnatural light, and the shadow, the writhing, inhuman thing that seemed to move of its own accord. He had been so sure, for 3 years, that he knew her. But now he didn't know who, or what, he had been living with. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his body tense and his mind replaying the events of the night before. It felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But the lingering cold in the room and the oppressive feeling of dread that clung to him like a second skin were very real. Zara lay beside him, seemingly asleep, her breathing soft and even. But Amir couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly sleeping. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, his body stiff with fear. Was she watching him? Was she waiting for something? The clock ticked loudly, the only sound in the room besides their breathing. As the hours dragged on, Amir finally slipped into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, the house felt different. The oppressive cold from the previous night had lifted, and the warm sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to dispel some of the lingering fear that had wrapped around Amir like a shroud. But as he moved about the kitchen, making coffee and preparing for work, he couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung in the air. Zara joined him, looking as radiant as ever, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She smiled at him, that same sweet smile that had drawn him in 3 years ago. But now, that smile sent a chill down his spine. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice gentle and kind, as if nothing had happened the night before. Amir forced a smile. "Yeah. I guess I was just restless." Zara gave him a knowing look, her eyes studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" Amir's stomach twisted. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't tell her that he had seen her for what she really was, or at least, part of it. He didn't even know if he could trust his own memory. Maybe it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. "I'm fine," he lied again, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just work stress." Zara reached out and touched his hand, her skin warm and soft. But the moment she touched him, that same electric shock coursed through his body, and Amir instinctively pulled away. Her smile faltered for just a second, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Then, just as quickly, her sweet demeanor returned. "You should relax more," she said softly. "Maybe take some time off." Amir nodded absently, not really hearing her. His mind was racing with questions. He needed answers. He needed to know who, or what, Zara really was. But how could he confront her? How could he ask her about the shadow he had seen, about the inhuman glow in her eyes? As the day wore on, Amir tried to go about his routine as usual, but everything felt wrong. Zara's presence was like a constant weight pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He found himself watching her out of the corner of his eye, waiting for some sign, some clue that would reveal the truth. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Amir could barely eat. His mind was a whirlwind of paranoia and fear. Zara, on the other hand, seemed perfectly calm, perfectly normal. She chatted about her day, asking him about work, laughing at some joke he barely heard. But every time he looked at her, he felt that same unease settle in his chest. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. "Zara," he said, his voice strained. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up from her plate, her dark eyes locking onto his. "Of course. You can ask me anything." Amir hesitated, the words catching in his throat. How could he even begin to ask? He swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Last night, something strange happened. He began slowly, watching her closely for any reaction. Her expression didn't change. What do you mean? I saw something. I think, he paused, his pulse racing. I think I saw something in the house. Zara's gaze didn't waver, but Amir thought he saw a flicker of something dark, behind her calm exterior. Something, she repeated, her voice steady. Like what? Amir's throat went dry. He didn't want to say it. He didn't want to confront her, but he had to know. A shadow, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't human. Zara's expression remained neutral, but there was something in the air now, a tension that hadn't been there before. She set down her fork and leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes boring into his. Amir, she said softly, you've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't there. Amir shook his head. No, I know what I saw. Zara's smile was cold now, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Are you sure? The room seemed to grow colder, the light dimming as if the shadows themselves were creeping closer. Amir felt a chill crawl up his spine, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I'm sure, he whispered, his voice trembling. Zara stood slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. She walked around the table and stood in front of him, her eyes never leaving his. You've always been so curious, she said softly, her voice almost a purr. But some things are better left unseen. Amir's heart pounded in his chest as she reached out and placed a hand on his cheek, her touch sending that familiar shock through his body. But this time, it wasn't just a static charge. It was something more, something dark, something powerful. You really want to know, don't you? Zara whispered, her lips curving into a sinister smile. Amir couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He could only watch in horror as the air around her began to ripple, like heat waves distorting the space between them. Zara's eyes darkened, her pupils dilating until they were nothing but black voids, endless and cold. Her smile twisted into something grotesque, her teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. You've always wondered, haven't you? She whispered. You've always felt that something wasn't quite right. Amir's body trembled, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the air around him grew thick and heavy. His mind screamed for him to run, to get away from her, but he was frozen in place, trapped by her gaze. You should have stayed ignorant, Amir, Zara continued, her voice low and dangerous. But now you've seen too much. Before Amir could react, the shadows around them surged forward, engulfing him in darkness. He gasped as the cold, suffocating blackness wrapped around him, pulling him under. He was falling, sinking into the abyss, his mind spiraling out of control. He could hear Zara's laughter echoing in the distance, her voice mocking and cruel. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Amir found himself standing in the middle of the living room, gasping for air. The shadows were gone, the oppressive cold lifted. But Zara was standing in front of him, her face calm, her eyes once again dark and human. What just happened? Amir stammered, his voice shaky. Zara smiled sweetly, as if nothing had happened at all. You're tired, love. You should rest. Amir blinked, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare? Or was this reality? He couldn't be sure anymore. Zara walked past him, her hand brushing lightly against his arm as she headed toward the bedroom. Come to bed, she called over her shoulder. You'll feel better in the morning. Amir stood frozen in place, his mind racing. He didn't know what to believe anymore. He didn't know who, or what, he was living with. But one thing was certain. His wife was not an ordinary person. And whatever she was, it was far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 3: Unraveling the Truth. Amir stood in the hallway for what felt like hours after Zara had disappeared into the bedroom. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, terror gripping his every nerve. He knew now, beyond any doubt, that Zara was not human. The woman he had shared his life with for the past 3 years was something far more sinister, far older than he could comprehend. But what was she? And why had she chosen him? His legs felt like they might give out beneath him, but he couldn't stop. He needed answers. He couldn't continue living in fear, unsure if the next moment would be his last. Amir turned his gaze to the dark hallway leading to their shared bedroom. Everything in his mind screamed for him to run, to escape, but he needed to know. With hesitant steps, Amir approached the bedroom door. His hand shook as he reached for the knob, but before he could turn it, a whisper, soft but clear, slithered into his ear. "You shouldn't have stayed." The voice wasn't Zara's. It was something else, something ancient and cold, a voice that felt as though it was coming from the walls themselves. Amir stumbled backward, his heart pounding. His breathing became erratic as the shadowy corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, warping in ways his mind couldn't process. The whisper returned, echoing all around him now. "You were never meant to know, never meant to see." Amir's body felt heavy, his muscles tightening with dread. He had to leave, now. He turned and rushed down the hallway, through the living room, and out the front door into the cool night air. His pulse was racing, and his hands trembled as he fumbled to unlock his car door. Without looking back, he threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and drove away as fast as he could. The quiet streets of the city passed by in a blur. He wasn't even sure where he was going, he just needed to get as far away from that house, from Zara, as possible. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts. Had she always been like this? How had he never noticed? Was any of the love they shared real? Or was it all a trick, a ruse to keep him close? As the adrenaline began to fade, Amir found himself pulling into the parking lot of a small diner on the outskirts of the city. The bright neon sign buzzed above, casting an eerie glow over the lot. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at his trembling hands, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He stepped inside the diner, its warmth and the chatter of other patrons momentarily grounding him in reality. He found a booth in the far corner and ordered a coffee. His thoughts were still swirling, but at least here, surrounded by the mundane, he felt a little safer. But that safety was fleeting. The truth was still looming over him, suffocating him. As he sipped his coffee, Amir's phone buzzed on the table. His heart skipped a beat. He hesitated before picking it up. It was a text message from Zara. "Come home. We need to talk." Amir's blood ran cold. How had she found him so quickly? His first instinct was to throw the phone away, to ignore her entirely, but he couldn't. Despite everything, a part of him still needed answers. He couldn't run forever. He had to confront her. Taking a deep breath, Amir replied, "What are you?" A moment passed before a response came, "Come home and I'll tell you everything. You deserve to know." The message chilled into his core, but he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to escape this nightmare, he had to face her. He finished his coffee, left some cash on the table, and headed back to his car. The drive back to the house felt longer than usual. The city streets, normally comforting in their familiarity, seemed darker, more foreboding. Every passing shadow felt like it was watching him, every flickering streetlight a reminder of the unnatural forces he had seen inside his home. When he finally pulled up to the house, the lights inside were still on. The front door, slightly ajar, beckoned him with an ominous air. Steeling himself, Amir stepped out of the car and approached the house. His hand hovered over the door for a moment before he pushed it open and stepped inside. Zara was waiting for him in the living room, sitting calmly on the couch. Her face was serene, almost welcoming, but Amir could see the truth now. There was something lurking beneath that exterior, something far darker than he had ever imagined. "Amir," she said softly, "sit with me." He remained standing, keeping his distance. "Tell me the truth, Zara. I want to know what you are." She sighed, her expression shifting from calm to something more serious, more ancient. "You've always been curious, haven't you? Even when we first met, I could sense it in you, the hunger for knowledge, for understanding." Amir's jaw tightened. "Stop playing games. Just tell me." Zara's eyes darkened, her voice becoming colder, more detached. "I am not like you. I never was. I am older than this world, older than anything you can comprehend. You call us jinn, spirits of the unseen, beings of fire and shadow." Amir's stomach dropped. The word jinn sent a shiver through his spine. He had heard stories, old tales passed down in hushed voices about these ancient beings who lived in a realm parallel to the human world. But they were just myths, weren't they? Zara stood and began to pace the room, her movements graceful but unsettling. "We exist in a place between worlds, Amir. We are not bound by your laws, your physics. Some of us are peaceful, but others are not." Her eyes flashed with something dark. "I am one of those who walks in shadow, who thrives in darkness." Amir's heart pounded. "Why me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why did you choose me?" Zara stopped pacing and turned to him, her face softening for just a moment. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. At first, you were just a curiosity. A human who caught my attention. I never intended to stay this long, to become attached. But you were different, Amir. You intrigued me." Amir swallowed hard. "Was any of it real? Did you ever love me?" Zara's expression faltered, and for the first time, Amir saw something like vulnerability in her eyes. "I tried to love you," she whispered. "In my way, I did. But our worlds are too different. What you call love, it doesn't exist where I come from." The words struck Amir like a blow. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had believed about their life together, was a lie. "So what now?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Are you going to kill me?" Zara's eyes darkened again, her smile returning, cold and cruel. "I could," she said softly, her voice like velvet wrapped around a blade. "But I won't. Not yet." Amir's pulse quickened. "Why not?" Zara stepped closer to him, her presence overwhelming, suffocating. "Because you still serve a purpose, Amir. There are forces in this world that you cannot begin to understand, and I need you. But the longer you stay with me, the more you will see. And once you've seen too much," she let the sentence hang, her meaning clear. Amir's breath caught in his throat. "Then what?" Zara leaned in close, her lips almost brushing his ear. "Then you belong to me." The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening and twisting once again. Amir's heart raced as he took a step back, but Zara's eyes followed him, predatory and unrelenting. "You're afraid," she whispered, her voice dripping with satisfaction. Good. Fear makes you stronger, more aware. But don't try to run, Amir. No matter where you go, I will always find you. Amir's mind screamed at him to flee, but his legs felt rooted to the ground, trapped by her gaze. His pulse pounded in his ears as the darkness around them seemed to close in. I'll let you leave, Zara said, stepping back and giving him room to breathe. For now. But remember, Amir, you are mine. Amir didn't need any more encouragement. He bolted for the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know where he was going or how he could possibly escape this nightmare, but he knew one thing for certain. Zara, his wife, his love, was no longer human. And she would never let him go.
If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.